So it's been yet another crazy week of racing news, and since last week's show where I talked about a variety of racing topics was so popular and well received, we're going to do it once again this week. It wasn't just Fernando Alonso who announced his retirement this week. There were several major NASCAR retirements. Most notably, Kasey Kahne will no longer race in the Monster Energy Series at all starting in 2019. He will vacate the number 95 for Levine Family Racing. Also, Elliott Sadler will vacate the number 1 junior motorsports car in the Xfinity Series. Sadler has been one of the stalwarts in that series and finished second in the championship last year. Now, I suspect this means that Sadler for sure is probably done with racing. I wouldn't be surprised to see him on Fox Sports within the next year, because that seems to be where all the retired Xfinity drivers seem to go. We'll see him on the pit lane reports with Regan Smith, I'm sure. Kasey Kahne is a much more interesting topic to discuss because Kasey is still fairly young. I think he's 39 years old. And in racing terms, even as racing drivers tend to skew younger these days, he's got a lot left in the tank if he chooses to do it. And if the implications from Tony Stewart were any indication, Kahne may very well do a full season of World of Outlaws next year. And don't be surprised if you see him in some other premier open-wheel racing in the United States. As looking for this season, at the end of last season, Kahne was looking at doing some IndyCar Series races, most notably the Indianapolis 500, if he couldn't find a full-time Cup ride. Ultimately, he did find a full-time Cup ride, so a lot of those discussions kind of broke down, but he wouldn't be the first NASCAR driver, or at least a driver that's associated with NASCAR, that's been looking at an Indy 500 program. And we're not talking Tony Stewart here either, because I'm not so sure, again, how serious those Tony Stewart discussions were. But in 2016, Brian Vickers looked at putting a program together very seriously with the Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports team. I believe that ended up going to Jay Howard. And then you look at a guy like Kurt Busch, who in 2014 did actually make a start in the Indianapolis 500, actually did the double that year, finished 6th at Indianapolis driving for Andretti Autosport. Now, with as crazy as the IndyCar Series offseason has been so far, is there really a cut and dried place that a guy like Kasey Kahne could go, even just for the Indy 500? It would be hard to say at this point. There's so many moving parts, and one of those biggest parts has to do with some guy named Fred. Yes, the only reason that this topic is sitting at number 2 on the board is because I already did a 19-minute video talking about this topic. But yes, Fernando Alonso did announce his intention to not race in Formula One next season, and as soon as that happened, there was an avalanche of rumors and speculation and concrete evidence that Fernando Alonso is going to be making a move to IndyCar next year. The most notable thing that has broken since then is that Alonso is planning on participating in a manufacturer test with Andretti Autosport and Honda, interestingly enough, at the Barber Motorsports Park on September the 5th. Now, Alonso, interestingly enough, that was the first IndyCar race he ever attended back in 2017, just after he announced his intentions to race in the Indianapolis 500. So it'll be Alonso's first taste of not only a road course in an IndyCar, but it'll also be his first taste of the Universal Aero Kit, which of course has less downforce than the previous Aero Kits that were in use when Alonso drove in the 500 last year. I'm not expecting there will be much of a transitional period for Fernando. I think he's going to adapt real well to it. The other breaking news about this is that Racer Magazine has been pretty adamant, more or less, that Alonso will not be racing for Andretti Autosport proper next season. He will be farmed out to the Harding Racing team. Now, whether that team is known as Harding Racing next year or not remains to be seen, and how many cars that team actually ends up fielding also remains to be seen. It also remains to be seen whether or not Harding becomes McLaren proper. the Andretti Junior team, as the name has kind of been floated out there for not only Alonso, but drivers like Colton Herta or Pato O'Ward moving up from the Indy Lights division to come race in IndyCar. So we could see an expansion of the team now known as Harding Racing. It may not be known as that next year. We do know that Harding's been evaluating drivers for next year, and they also have Gabby Chavez under contract for 2019. So how many cars and drivers are actually going to be affected by all of this Alonso nonsense? I have no idea. There's so many moving parts, but it certainly does seem like Alonso will be driving an Andretti, McLaren, Harding, Chevy in next year's IndyCar series rather than an Andretti Autosport Honda. Now, that being said, there was a story that came out that Honda was perfectly all right with Alonso driving their equipment next year. Interesting PR move, seeing as there has been so much mud thrown between the two parties in the last year and a half. That being said, it's a smart PR move on Honda's part, because last thing you want to do is when the biggest star comes into IndyCar racing in 25 years, you generally don't want to be on his bad side or even his fans' bad side or the hype train's bad side. So this Alonso story is going to keep developing, and you just know that we're going to get a whole lot more crazy news coming down the pipeline. So let's go from the kind of most anticipated driver coming into IndyCar to potentially the least anticipated driver coming into IndyCar racing. And it's the man, the myth, the legend, Santino Ferrucci. Kind of disgracefully dismissed from Formula 2 for a variety of unsportsmanlike and I think most people would probably describe as blatantly racist behavior toward a teammate of his. He ran 2 IndyCar races directly after this in the Detroit doubleheader for Dale Coyne Racing, and he will be racing in the final 2 races of the IndyCar series this year with a car that I can only describe as pretty much a Buddy Lazier throwback at Portland and Sonoma, also for Dale Coyne Racing, but this time in a third car. The number is 39, as you can see. So, a lot of people are upset about this, and I understand why you're upset about this. What I don't understand is why you didn't expect it. Either if you didn't expect that Santino Ferrucci was going to find a seat somewhere in racing, it just happened to be IndyCar, I'm sorry, but you don't know how this business works. Ferrucci's got a ton of money behind him. His dad's rich. It doesn't matter what he said. Somebody was going to take his check. It just happened to be Dale Coyne Racing. Now, I absolutely cannot endorse the actions that Ferrucci has pulled recently. But at the same time, I can't say, this is a bad thing for the sport, because it does mean that there's another car on the track. And this was another thing that came up recently when IndyCar announced that there were driver standards coming out, where they were going to evaluate drivers based on their prior records and accomplishments to grant them an IndyCar license. And many people said that these regulations were going to prevent a guy like Ferrucci from coming into the sport. To which I would say also, not only does Ferrucci have this money behind him, but he also has the proper prerequisites. He's driven F1 cars. That means he qualifies for a super license, and the IndyCar quotes themselves described these regulations as a slimmed down version of the super license. So if Ferrucci qualified for the super license already, then he most certainly qualifies to drive an IndyCar next year. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on what part of the fandom, I guess, you fall into. That being said, there's a potential that there'll be a third Dale Coyne car on the grid full-time next year. And if that means a guy like Sebastian Bourdais and a guy like Pietro Fittipaldi can stay on the team full-time for next year, is that necessarily a bad thing? I'm not so sure. There are certainly always going to be not the nicest people in racing. Unfortunately, there's a history of dirty money in racing. Now, does that mean we should accept it? No. Does that mean Ferrucci's probably going to get booed a whole lot? Yes. Can he recover his image? Be hard to see. Again, the IndyCar paddock's one of the nicest in racing, as evidenced by quotes from a guy like Fernando Alonso. And maybe some good things will rub off on Santino. Maybe someday he'll actually give a proper apology for some of his actions, or maybe he'll just apologize through good behavior from now on. But the way he raced in Detroit seems to imply to me that it's probably not going to go the way you think, or maybe it will go the way you think. But again, Yeah, this is a story that I know the internet's going to be very outraged about. I would say I'm fairly neutral on it. Again, an extra car on the grid is an extra car on the grid, one way or the other. But certainly, Ferrucci isn't going to be the most well-loved person in IndyCar racing. That is for sure. Finally, some more DPI P2 split news incoming. It recently broke that Juncos Racing, which currently drives or fields cars in the Verizon IndyCar Series and the Mazda Road to Indy, will be fielding a Cadillac DPI in the IMSA Series next year. That brings the potential car count in DPI to around about 13, 14 cars. The interesting part about that is nearly half of them will be Cadillacs next year. There's as many as 6 or 7 that could potentially be on the grid at next year's Rolex 24. There goes that diversity in IMSA. Unfortunately, it seems like the DPI category is going to be vast majority Cadillac. You could almost call it Spec Caddy. There's going to be the 2 Mazdas, the 2 Acuras, and then fingers crossed we keep the ESM, or at least one of the ESM Nissans for next season. Now, that being said, I think it's really good that Juncos Racing is expanding. It's really cool to see this team kind of grow from a very small operation into a much larger one, and helping get South American drivers kind of back involved in the top levels of American racing. Now, there was a question that I had personally about Juncos Racing becoming a part of IMSA. Is this a response to the driver regulations that may keep a guy like Rene Binder from bringing a big check to IndyCar next year for Ricardo Juncos to bring a IndyCar on the grid for next year? That's a question. Now, there was an article out there that stated that maybe it wasn't the IndyCar program we need to be worried about. Maybe it's the Road to Indy program, which is perhaps even more concerning considering that Juncos provides cars on the Indy Lights grid as well as IndyCar's grid. So, and if we're talking about a series that needs the car count, it's not IndyCar right now, it's Indy Lights, and that's a potential 1 or 2 cars that won't be on the grid for that series next season if Juncos decides to throw all the eggs in the DPI basket. That's an interesting prospect, and it's something I talked about on Twitter when this regulation came out that was kind of meant to get drivers to go to Indy Lights for a couple years to develop their skills and come to IndyCar. I said, if you've got a check that's big enough for Indy Lights and big enough for IndyCar, if you're told you can't go into IndyCar, you're not going to go to Lights, you're going to go to IMSA, possibly DPI. I thought it would be P2 where they would go and race for overall wins, or at least glory. You'll be on TV. You won't be stuck on NBC Sports Gold. And we may be seeing the end results of that particular regulation. Speaking of the P2 class, PR1 Mathiasen Motorsports has dumped its Ligier chassis for an Oreca for the rest of the season. Now, this is going to be kind of, unfortunately, par for the course with the global spec P2 cars, particularly starting next season. You're going to need an Oreca to run at the front in that class, and at the moment, it looks at most like there's going to be 3 or 4 of those prototypes on the grid next year. An unfortunate reality of the situation is that this P2 DPI split is that not only have we lost the diversity in the prototype class itself, but we've completely lost it in P2 now. Now that P2 is essentially exactly the same as the WEC from a regulation standpoint, this also means that the only competitive car in P2 right now for the bulk of the season, again, is the Oreca. So we're seeing all the teams start to move in that direction. Speaking of that, United Autosports, one of the other Ligier teams, but a team that was only participating in the Patron North American Endurance Cup this year, will also be shelving its Ligier P2 car for the final race that they had planned at Petit Le Mans. They won't be there, and they won't even be participating in the full 2019 schedule, as they will be trying to prepare a DPI car for 2020. Now, that you would think that would be a good news, but they didn't really have a manufacturer in mind. Zach Brown has talked about a potential for a McLaren DPI. Maybe they would buy an Acura or even possibly upgrade their current Ligier to the on-road Nissan that is currently used by ESM. But there's only talk about that, and nothing apparently is going to be happening with United Autosports in IMSA in 2019, which is even, again, another casualty of this. Another potential casualty is the Jackie Chan Racing Team, or Joda Sport, as my friend Kevin would say. They said they won't run the Rolex this year, which they did this year, bringing 2 cars to the lead class, unless they can get their hands on a DPI, of which the DPIs are fairly limited, and it would be a potential, or the only potential car they could probably get their hands on short notice is a Cadillac, unless for some reason Acura decides to lend them bodywork and an engine to run one race, which I'd be very surprised about. So unless Jackie Chan Racing can get a Cadillac, they won't be in the Rolex next year. Is there any positives to this DPI formula? Well, the only thing right now is looking like there's a potential that Ford will be entering the category. This was reported by Marshall Pruitt on Racer.com that they are still heavily evaluating a potential DPI move coming in the next few years. So certainly a Ford versus GM battle in the top class would be very fascinating, as well as Team Penske up there. That could be quite good. But again, talk is cheap, and right now, the moves that IMSA has made with their prototype division, I can't see as 100% positive. There's some good things. There's a few new teams moving in, but again, a prototype split has only killed the diversity in the class, which before this season or during this season has been incredibly interesting, and the dynamic between the P2 cars and the DPIs has been a fascinating one to watch. And now we've essentially got Spec Caddy versus Spec Orica, and is that really compelling prototype racing? It's hard to say. So that was This Week in Racing. Let me know down in the comments what you think of all the topics. I'm certain that there's a couple topics in here that are going to get a lot of comments, so I look forward to reading the discussion. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Subscribe for more motorsport content like this on my channel. And if you're going to the Pocono IndyCar race this weekend and you see me, wave, say hi, shake my hand, and yeah, give me some feedback on the channel, because I always love the free feedback. So thank you guys, and we'll see you in the next video.